So the key findings of our report, and these are the three things, the three key takeaways, and I'll try to go very briefly into more depth on each of them. First of all, we identified a tremendously increased tension among Muslim Americans post 9/11 about their position in American society, and we'll talk about that, causes, discrimination, but I think it's even occurred in greater extents, maybe even in the more recent years than in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Second, we collected some data, which I'm going to share with you, that we find low, but not insignificant number of radicalized and violent Muslim Americans. And third, one of the core questions we set out to identify and look at, that practices of Muslim American, we identified a number of practices of Muslim American communities that we believe are preventative of radicalization. I'm going to go into each of these in some depth, and then I hope we can get to them in questions as well. So this point of the position and the feelings of Muslim Americans in our recent era, in our current era, is definitely one captured by this phrase of homeland insecurity. I think there is really a genuine, deep concern within this community of what is their place? Do they have a place that they can feel secure in and comfortable as a pathway to full participation in mainstream American life? And I don't think, prior to 9/11, I don't think you would have seen much differences between Muslims and other ethnic groups. The same kinds of complaints, but not this kind of deep-seated concern about the future and whether a truly integrated, participatory future was possible. And I think you're seeing this, and I put up lots of different instances, things that we see on the internet, websites that are, really very virulent anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. It's definitely bleeds into our political system, where it is a tactic and acceptable to say things and accuse Muslim Americans of doing things that it would not be acceptable to say about any other religious or ethnic group. And of course, the portrayals in the media of Muslim Americans in association with terrorists, which I represent in this slide with Jack Bauer. This pervasiveness, I think, is really causing a serious problem. What did we find in terms of the level of radicalization and violence? And I can't describe exactly where we did the cutoff on this data set, but we're talking about people who've been prosecuted for terrorism-related offense involving violence. And over the entire time since 9/11, up until the end of the study, which is the end of last year, we compiled 139 Muslim Americans are in our data set who were either prosecuted or arrested pending trial or had committed acts of violence and were killed in the process. And that includes people who have gone abroad to join foreign forces in kind of a jihadi movement. A couple of data points about this group. So this is an average of 16, 17 people per year. And if you compare during the same period of time that the 139 Muslim Americans engaged in violence, there were 136,000 murders in America. So just to try to place that in some sort of context and social problem. 37% of these were domestic plots. The other individuals were interested in things abroad. 61% of these individuals were citizens. Others were permanent resident aliens or illegal. 34%, so a disproportionately high number of people in our data set were converts as opposed to immigrants. 56% were part of large groups. The average age of these individuals was 28. Interestingly, in the American Muslim population, the individuals in the data set were spread really almost evenly across ethnic groups: African Americans, Arabs, Somalis, South Asian, whites, and even a category of other, which kind of suggests if your solution to some of these problems is ethnic profiling, good luck. The incidence, as I said, an average 16, 17 per year, but you see a very large spike in 2009, and some people are using that data to suggest that, well, homegrown terrorism, this has demonstrated, proven that homegrown terrorism is on the rise. This is something we have to be deeply concerned about in the United States. I think it's just much too early to tell. A lot of that 41 was driven by the 20 individuals who went to Somalia from Minneapolis to join Shabab. This year we would have added 5 people so far in our database, so extrapolated over the whole year that would be about 20 people, close to the average, so I think it's too early to tell on that. So let me summarize the anti-radicalization actions we identified that we found in Muslim American communities. First, we saw very strong, consistent, across-the-board, deep-rooted denunciations of violence by leaders in the communities, which we felt were important to communicate to both an outside audience and to internally. Second, we found very strong self-policing actions. So whereas prior to 9/11 you might have found the radical speakers invited and accepted in mosques and much more activity along those lines, much more strict about denying platforms to people to espouse those views. And then when the individuals who engaged in radical discussions and talk and the adoption of the ideology, discussions of violence, they would be thrown out of the mosque. There's evidence of lots of cooperation with law enforcement as to identifying these individuals. So we see a lot of self-policing on behalf of the community themselves. We identified community building activities as being preventative of radicalization. Community building activities we think were caused for other reasons. They weren't put in to help prevent against radicalization, but they have that effect. The stronger community social networks are, the less likely it is people fall through the cracks. The more likely it is that people who are falling by the wayside, who are isolated, who are adopting this ideology might be identified in time for intervention. We identified increased political activism as an important aspect of ameliorating radicalization, to demonstrate that grievances, not necessarily the top of their list, maybe complaints about the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian conflict, those things weren't necessarily to be solved through political activism, but the notion that through politics you can have your grievances addressed, whether they're at the local level or the national level, through politics. We think that's important as a demonstration for youth and other Muslims in America, but also as a demonstration to the rest of the world that in America, that is the way we solve our problems, and that Muslims are getting more active in politics, which some people see as a real threat. That Sharia law is going to be opposed in America. I mean, you hear that on the internet, you see that even political commentators. We see political activism as a positive. And finally, this notion of identity politics. People who are identifying and describing themselves as Muslim Americans as a trend that is increasing, a greater piety, a greater religious activism. Again, we find that as something which is somewhat counterintuitive. We argue that this is a positive trend, that people who are more educated and more closely identified and have a firm vision of Islam are much less likely to engage in terrorism and are better likely to educate their youth about the falsities of this ideology. Again, it's counterintuitive because there's a lot of fear in America that if we have more people who are more pious, Muslims who are more identifying as Muslims, that is a threat. And we disagree. We think that is a positive and an ameliorative trend. So I think since we have another speaker, I'm going to wrap that up. Our report, Anti-Terror Lessons in Muslim Communities, is available on the Duke Public Policy website. You're welcome to take a look at it, and certainly contact me if you have questions or you want to make a comment. Thank you.